Hi, this is Bob Wells here, and welcome to Undercurrent Stories. This is the show where we hear about people's interests and uncover some fascinating stories at the same time. I hope you enjoy today's show. When we think of Bonfire Night on 5th of November, we tend to just think of Guy Fawkes. However, my guest today explains how Guy Fawkes was just one of a group of conspirators led by Robert Catesby, the mastermind behind the plot to blow up the Houses of Parliament in 1605. My guest is historian Bill Cunningham, and in this episode we talk about the circumstances that inspired and led up to the plot, the characters behind it, and how it was eventually foiled. Please be aware that there are some graphic descriptions of torture in this episode, which some listeners may find disturbing. Hello and welcome to Undercurrent Stories. In today's show, I am delighted to be joined again by Bill Cunningham. Bill is an historian and tour guide, and as well as his interest in all things history, he is a member of the Stamford Mayor's Guides. Bill is going to give us an insight into the history of the Gunpowder Plot and tell us some fascinating stories in the process. Hello and welcome to the show, Bill.
Good afternoon, Bob.
Or should I say welcome back to the show?
Thank you very much.
Well, it's great to have you on again. Thanks so much for coming on.
That's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So how have things been on the history front?
Yes, fairly steady. Yes, I read and research and carry on. I'm still researching about Stamford and its background, and I've got a little theme at the moment. I'm looking into English aristocratic families, and I've still got my little bit I enjoy about the Georgians and the Regency time. So yes, I constantly read history. Yeah. It's my little thing in life now. Well,
that's great. I mean, one or two of the people that are listening will have heard you before, Bill. This is the third time you've been on, actually. But before we talk about your interest in history, what's your background?
Well, my background is essentially I spent years working in finance and industry, and that ended beginning of this year when I decided to pack it all in. And I've really taken up my hobby, which has been history. So I'm doing the Stamford Mayor's Guides, where we do guided tours of Stamford. Currently, we've been doing the standard tour, and recently we've been doing Halloween tours as well about spooks and ghosts. Then also I spent a bit of time, really last year, being a guide up at Grimsthorpe Castle, which is a local stately home. Unfortunately, this year, due to the COVID situation, our launch of the guides was somewhat delayed from March through to July, and Grimsthorpe Castle, unfortunately, has not opened up at all. So it's been a little bit affected by the COVID situation. But hopefully that'll be over and things can carry forward. Yeah, well,
I think we all hope it will be very soon. And on the other subject of history, what made you become so interested in history?
Don't know. I just always have. Always been with me since I was a small child. I read history books when I was 7 or 8, going back to all sorts of things. I read War and Peace when I was about 11 or 12.
11 or 12?
Yeah, I just love the whole thing. I can imagine the people in my mind. You can give me dates and I'll remember them. It's just one of those things. I could read a book about history. It was sinking in my brain. But give me a book about finance or legal trusts or things like that. It'll take me about 50 times to read before it makes any sense.
It just stimulates you.
It does.
You find it very interesting.
And why I'm into, I really don't know.
No. Okay.
I'm a bit of a nerd, really.
No, that's fine. We've all got our interests, and so today we're going to talk about the Gunpowder Plot. Mm-hmm. It's now the 1st of November, so we're only a few days away from the big day, or should we say the big day that never happened? So. Again, I suppose it's a similar question. How did you become interested in the Gunpowder Plot?
I really sort of got a bit of an interest in that time when I was doing my A-level back in the 70s. And one of the things we were doing was 16th and 17th century European history. And it was a very strong European emphasis. We did an awful lot of Spanish and French side of things. And when you do those two centuries, you have to take into account the wars of religion and things of that nature. For some strange reason, I really got quite interested in the religious feelings of the times of the 16th and 17th century. Yeah. And you can't help but notice and follow on. The whole Gunpowder Plot stems from religious friction and faction, and I even now I've carried on doing that when I'm reading about the Georgians and the Regency time. I'm following through an awful lot about Catholic emancipation and the strictures and governances that Catholics had to undergo for many years. And a lot of that does stem from the Gunpowder Plot in some respects.
Yeah.
It's just an overall part of a theme that I enjoy.
Well, I think, like a lot of people, myself included, we know about the Gunpowder Plot, or we think we know a little bit about it. We know about the plot to blow up the Houses of Parliament.
Gunpowder treason, yes.
Gunpowder treason. But we have fireworks and everything. So not everybody knows the whole history of it, I don't think. So this particular show, we're going to try and condense the whole thing into about half an hour, just so that everybody's got a bit of an idea about how it happened. So, starting off, Bill, what was the background to the Gunpowder Plot?
Essentially, the background to it is in the roots of religion. Obviously, England became a Protestant country, particularly with the start of Elizabeth's reign. And during that time, Protestants were the ascendant religion, and the Catholics were often seen as being alien, and they following the rules of a foreign power, namely the Pope. It didn't help that in 1570 the Pope actually declared it would be legitimate to kill the sovereign, i.e. Elizabeth. And there's a whole series of Catholics...
Sorry, just a minute there. He said it would be legitimate to kill Elizabeth.
Yes.
So this had stemmed from Henry VIII,
that's right,
who'd sort of parted company with the Roman Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. And his daughter Elizabeth carried it on, but he said it would be okay to kill her. Yes,
that's right. So basically, you've got a foreign agency saying that it's okay to kill the monarch, which really wasn't a good idea. And so there was a series of Catholic plots against Elizabeth's life, particularly during the time when Mary Queen of Scots was alive, and that carried on right the way through up until her death. And because of that, Catholics were repressed. I mean, the repression really would be mainly directed at quite often the gentry, quite frankly, because most common people would just go along with the flow. They would just carry on. But the repression would mean that, for example, you'd have to attend church at the Anglican Church. If you did not attend the Anglican Church, then you would be fined. You'd have to have your children married in the Anglican Church, baptised in the Anglican Church, and also indeed buried under their rites. And a lot of the wealthier Catholics would not attend church, and because of that, they would be fined. And they became known as recusants, and therefore they would be pay hefty fines for not attending church and doing the other things. They found ways around the marriages and things like that, because there'd be the whole cadre of priests and Jesuits which were hidden within England, and at very great danger to their own lives. And if they were caught, they would be executed.
So in terms of the numbers of people that were Catholics in England at that time, Bill, what sort of rough percentage of the population were, strictly speaking, original Catholics?
I would probably think declared and open, probably a very small amount, but under the surface, I've no doubt there would be a lot of people adhering to the old religion.
It must have been a very difficult time if you were Catholic.
It would have been. I mean, Catholicism was strongest in the north, in Yorkshire and Lancashire. And other parts of the south east are much less prevalent. But certainly among the gentry, and they could afford to do it. And let's face it, an awful lot of the peasantry and the ordinary people, they just want to get on with their lives as they do in all times.
So in summary then, the Gunpowder Plot was all about the aggravation that was being caused by the state with making people go to the Church of England. Yes,
and the perpetrators of the plot were gentry. Apart from one, and I would like to think there would be lots of servants and people like who still adhered to the old faith, but probably kept quiet about it.
And who was the one that you mentioned?
One of the plotters was the servant of the instigator of the plot,
right?
And he was only included because he found out about the plot, and his master Robert Catesby sort of persuaded him to join to keep him.
And just so listeners are aware of the time it took place, what year did the plot take place?
The actual plot took place in 1605.
And how long was it brewing up for before?
Best part 2 years.
Right. Okay.
When Elizabeth died, the throne was going to go to James VI of Scotland, and a lot of Catholics then were thinking this could be a change, because there were persecutions before, and to be fair, there's some justification of the persecutions because there were lots of plots against Elizabeth and her life. And they generally did involve a lot of Catholics in it. But James I, a lot of Catholics thought things would change. Prior to becoming king, he made lots of promises to various people as a way it means becoming king. And one of the things he was making promises to the Spaniards and to other people that he'd go lax on the Catholic laws, oppression laws. And that's one of the things he did. And the other thing that made the Catholics very optimistic was his wife was Queen Anne of Denmark, the daughter of the King of Denmark. And she was brought up a Lutheran, but she converted to Catholicism. And King James I tolerated that, or King James VI, as it was then in Scotland, tolerated that. And he did. He was the daughter of son of Mary, Queen of Scots, who was a notable Catholic. So they were quite optimistic that James would be accommodating. Also, James wanted to have a treaty with Spain. England had been at war with Spain for over 20 years, and he wanted to have a peace with Spain. And they thought the Spaniards would influence James to be, repeal the laws and be a lot gentler. That didn't turn out. Partly because even though James got to the throne, there were still plots against him in quite early days, and he did change his mind a bit. And the Spaniards weren't bothered about English Catholics and their freedoms; they just wanted to have peace with England for economic reasons. And that kicked it off. That's when they thought, we need change. But that was probably from a tiny fraction of Catholics. One in particular, who I considered to be a terrorist and a fanatic, who quite early on decided that he wanted to do away with the king. And from a very early start, within months of James coming to the throne, he decided he was going to get rid of him.
And who was this?
A guy called Robert Catesby.
Right, so he was the leader of the Gunpowder Plot.
We focus on Guy Fawkes.
We do, yeah.
All the time.
Yeah.
No, he was not the man.
No.
Robert Catesby, sometimes known as Robin Catesby.
Yeah. So why do we focus so much on Guy Fawkes?
Because he was a man who's caught with the fuse and the matches, really.
Right. So he was the man who'd had experience with weapons before.
Yes, that's why he was recruited. He was a mercenary.
Right.
Recruited when he's fighting in the Low Countries, which is what is now Holland and Belgium, fighting for the Spanish against the Dutch. He was a Catholic, and he was an Englishman from Yorkshire. And he was a soldier by trade and an explosive expert to boot.
Yeah. So tell us about Robert Catesby.
Now, Robert Catesby was a Catholic gentleman from the Midlands, Warwickshire, born in Lapworth. And he was a bit of a wild cannon. He was kept under control whilst his wife was still alive and his father was still alive. But after that, he was a bit of a loose cannon. He got involved in the plot to topple Queen Elizabeth in about 1601 by a chap called Devereux, Earl of Essex. It was a famous plot, and this Earl wanted to depose Elizabeth. It failed, and Catesby is one of the conspirators, along with several other Catholic gentry. And he was going to be executed, but Queen Elizabeth pardoned him.
Oh, right.
And with a big fine, obviously. And what really strikes me about this man's fanaticism was within a few months of being pardoned, he was yet again trying to plot against the Queen. You suddenly think, hang on, you've had your go. You could have been executed in a very nasty way, and she's let you off. Have a bit of grace.
And this was all over religion?
Well, basically, he wanted to get the laws repealed, and hence he campaigned with that. So when James came along, and James didn't relax the laws, and James was initially quite relaxed about it, but with all the stirrings up, he got a bit more keen on the repression bit, and that's when Catesby decided, right, we're going to deal with this, and that was quite early on.
So Catesby's a bit of a leader, a bit of a ringleader for this type of stuff.
He was the leader.
Yeah. So what other characters were involved in the plot?
Obviously, you had a chap called Guy Fawkes, or Guido Fawkes, as he was known then.
Guido Fawkes.
Yeah. And he was a soldier recruited later on into the conspiracy.
And where was he from?
He was literally Yorkshire, but when he's recruited, he was in the Low Countries as a soldier, mercenary fighting. And he was a tough character. And obviously a fanatical Catholic. You had others like the Wintour Brothers, again Catholic gentry. Thomas Percy, a distant relative of the Duke of Earl of Northumberland. Francis Tresham, the son of a very notable Northamptonshire Catholic recusant, a guy called Thomas Tresham, who's left various monuments to his faith in around the Kettering area of Northampton. And Francis Tresham, he inherited from his father a few months before the plot. You had a chap called Everard Digby, who I'm particularly keen on because he's from a local family from round here, from Rutland, from Dry Stone.
Yeah.
And he was a bit of a gentleman. He was one of the last to be recruited. The common theme is that they're provincial gentry. Another common theme about them is they're all related as well.
Oh, are they?
Because you have quite a small group of people.
Yeah.
Within the English gentry, they're a very, very tiny minority. And because of their faith, they probably didn't really want to intermarry with Protestants. So they all tend to be interrelated. And, the brother-in-laws or cousins, etc.
So where did these guys meet then?
Initially, they met in London. Catesby got the scheme going together quite early on, and he steadily recruited plotters.
Yeah.
The initial ones were in London. They had several meetings later on at Daventry, and in the Midlands as well, Canons Ashby and Northamptonshire.
And how long did it take to actually prepare this plot?
Well, it initially was done quite early on.
And was it always the intention to blow up the Houses of Parliament?
Yes. That was Catesby's idea.
Yeah.
And he got it sorted out for about a year before the actual 5th of November 1605. He got it put together.
Yeah.
He hadn't recruited everybody, but Parliament was due to meet. But unfortunately, because the plague arose in London, they decided to postpone Parliament. So
this was the opening of the Houses of Parliament.
The opening of the Houses of Parliament.
Oh, right. So a bit like today, really, with COVID.
Absolutely, yeah. The plague arrived, a hell of a lot more destructive than the current one we have.
Yeah, I bet.
And they postponed the meeting of Parliament.
Right.
So instead of it going ahead in the November or then the February, it actually ended up getting towards November the 5th, 1605. So the plot was hatched to start a good year before the actual event itself. And he was going to go for Parliament. In those days, don't imagine Parliament. It's like the big, huge building you have now. The meeting where the King was going to be, as it is now, was in the House of Lords. And the House of Lords was a ramshackle old medieval building, which could quite conceivably be blown up by gunpowder.
Yeah.
And the idea was that they would store the gunpowder under the House of Lords. Initially, they rented premises next to the House of Lords and tried to dig a tunnel underneath it. That didn't really work out too well. And then, as luck would have it, the undercrofts were up for rent, came up for rent. And so they got the undercrofts underneath the cellars, i.e. underneath the House of Lords.
The undercrofts?
Undercrofts. That's we call them cellars now, but they're actually, in those days, known as undercrofts. That's where merchants would store their woolen or their goods or their things of that nature. So it'd be a good size, and that'd be nice and neatly underneath the House of Lords, and they could get the gunpowder in there and get ready for the great day.
36 barrels, I understand.
36 barrels, yes.
That's a lot of
heck of
ammunition to get in, isn't it?
Yeah. Guy Fawkes reckoned it would be it was more than twice the amount required. So they were going for the overkill. Now, we tend to sort of look at these guys thinking, the heroes, or they've got romance. They're terrorists.
Yeah.
Robert Catesby was a fanatical terrorist, as far as I'm concerned. He was utterly charismatic. People would follow him purely out of his character, and that's what they did. And when you think about it, their plan was to blow up the Houses of Parliament at the opening of Parliament. There you would have the King, his wife, Anne, his eldest son and heir, Henry. There'd be the House of Commons, the House of Lords, members of the public, men and women, Catholic and Protestant, the whole lot.
So potentially hundreds of people?
Hundreds would die. Hundreds. Now, that to me is an act of terrorism. They couldn't think, we'll take out the king. Must be like the killing of the French King Henry IV. We'll just sort of get a gun and shoot him. Oh, no, we'll blow up all these people, which actually in the end was their downfall. Yeah.
So, obviously the actual plot was foiled.
Yeah.
How was it foiled?
It was kept very, very secret for a while. I mean, Catesby was very canny what he did. He recruited very carefully. As I say, a lot of them were related, so he recruited among his cousins and in-laws, etc. And he kept it quite tight. on the numbers involved, and gradually had to expand a bit because they needed money, and they had to recruit other people like Francis Tresham because he got a bit of money.
Yeah.
So it gradually expanded a bit, but they'd done a pretty good job of keeping it quiet. But then about a week before the actual event, the 5th of November, a letter was delivered to the Catholic Lord Monteagle.
Yeah.
And that was delivered on the 26th of October. And he was at his tea or whatever, and a letter was delivered to him. And the letter was essentially saying, be very careful about attending the opening of Parliament in not so many words. It didn't say what was going to happen. The wording was structured somewhat differently. And that sort of gave a bit of a trigger and a bit of thought. Now, Lord Monteagle was, in fact, I'll read a bit of the letter here, actually. My Lord, out of the love I bear to some of your friends, I have care of your preservation. Therefore, I would advise you, as you tender your life, to devise some excuse to shift your attendance at this Parliament.
Well, that's very, very clear, Bill.
Absolutely. And he went on a little bit more.
Yeah.
Lord Monteagle, although he was a Catholic, and I have to say that these terrorists represented a tiny fraction of the Catholics in England, like today's situation. And Lord Monteagle took it to the Spy Master General and the Master Spider, Robert Cecil.
Oh, yeah.
Who was the son of William Cecil, who's Elizabeth I's great Lord Chancellor.
Yeah.
And he was also the main man for James I. And Robert Cecil had got it twigged. And he took it to the king, who was hunting up at Hatfield at the time. Several days went by. And oddly enough, one of the words in the actual letter mentioned blow. And rumour has it that King James twigged onto that because his father, Lord Darnley, had been murdered, and he'd been murdered by gunpowder in Edinburgh some years before. And so that's what twigged it off. And that's when they authorised a search of the underside of the House of Lords. And they initially found Guy Fawkes there by a whole stack of wood. And they quizzed him, and he said his name was John Johnson. And he was a servant of Thomas Percy, who'd rented the place. They went away. And then afterwards, Cecil decided, OK, let's check this out again. And they sent people in again.
So he just said he was doing something down there
and they sent them in again. Yeah. And they found Guy Fawkes yet again, because he was a man guarding it. Because what you bear in mind was, they put the gunpowder in, then prior to the 5th of November, Guy Fawkes was left his job was to set the thing off and guard it and set it off. All the other conspirators went up. They'd gone up to the Midlands because
get out of it.
Their job was to raise the country after the king had gone. So Guy Fawkes was the man in charge. The other ones, Catesby and that, they were going to get armed and raise a bit of a rebellion. Yeah. So Everard Digby, our local man from here, his job was he was based at just outside Coventry, and his job was to go to Coombe Abbey near Coventry to kidnap Princess Elizabeth. So the idea the king would be blown up, and Princess Elizabeth was his daughter, because his son and heir was going to be blown up down at Parliament. Yeah. And Princess Elizabeth thought they could kidnap her. She was 9 years of age, and she would become the future monarch. They'd turn her into a Catholic, and she'd be nice and amenable and amendable to become the monarch. Though, if you look at her later life, they picked the wrong woman.
Okay, so the plan was to blow Parliament up, kill all the people that were involved in power at that time.
That's right.
Go to the Midlands, get Elizabeth, make her a queen,
make her
a Protestant queen. A Catholic queen.
Turn her into a Catholic, and then have the rebellion. Yeah. Guy Fawkes' job was to be there. He was the only man there to set things off. But he was found the second time round. They obviously dug around, found the wood, had a bit of a fight, and he was captured.
They did. So they did have a bit of a fight down there.
Yeah, I think he put up a struggle.
They probably thought, what, this guy seems to spend an awful lot of time as a servant down in the cellars.
Why would we sat there guarding a pile of wood? Yeah. Obviously it wasn't. It was covering the gunpowder. Yeah. So he was taken to the Tower, and the others really fled properly up to the Midlands, and they carried on up there. Guy Fawkes was taken to the Tower, and King James authorised the use of torture. Nowadays, we think, it's common torture in the Tudor times, Stuart times. It happened all the time. No, it wasn't. had to be authorised by Parliament of the King. So King James had to authorise the torture of Guy. And in the letters to it, he first authorised mild torture, and then you could also go on to the major torture.
So mild torture, for example?
Mild torture was the manacles.
Right.
So you'd have the manacles put on you, and then you're hauled up by your arms, which is obviously extremely painful. Well, that was a mild torture. The other form of torture was the major torture, which is rarely used, and that was the rack. And
describe what the rack is, Bill.
The rack basically, the English one used in this circumstance was not one that was horizontal, it was vertical. So the prisoner would be stood, his hands tied above his head, and obviously also his feet tied to the other end of the rack, and it was ratcheted up, stretching an individual.
Ouch.
It was rarely authorised, but King James did authorise the use of the rack for Guy Fawkes. Normally when people shown the rack, often they were just shown it and they'd recant the thing and say everything. That usually worked. Yeah. But I think it's also good to say that England was not like continental Europe. Torture was not usual. And I think we ought to bear that in mind in some respects. So the rack would have been pretty horrendous. It would stretch you, dislocate your bones and your joints, and you've been pretty sorry state afterwards. Guy Fawkes held out for a couple of days, and then he betrayed. He didn't betray. He just, people will talk under those circumstances. He was a tough guy, and he obviously said who the conspirators were.
Well, I must admit, to be under that sort of pain with your sockets being pulled out. Yeah, it was a long time. Quite a brave guy.
Yeah, he was a brave. He's a tough guy. He's a mercenary, you know. And
so he then let out the names of the other conspirators.
Yeah, he gave out the names of the conspirators. Yeah. And to be fair, I reckon by then they got a pretty good idea. Yeah. I mean, Robert Cecil got his finger on the pulse, got a good idea. The conspirators, meanwhile, had fled up to the Midlands. Catesby ended up in Staffordshire.
So did word get out that the plot had been foiled?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. It'd been. Well, they knew. They could tell. They got.
Well, the fact it didn't go up, it didn't get blown up.
Yeah. They because they had people down there. One or two of them. Some of them were still down there. They knew about it. Gone. They fed up. Ended up in after raiding Warwick Castle for some arms and some horses. They ended up in Holbeach House in Staffordshire, and that's where some of them split up. I mean, the thing about Robert Catesby was he'd fled from London when he knew that the plot had gone wrong, and yet when he's at Holbeach House, he did say to the likes of Everard Digby, "Oh, the king is dead," and because Digby was already up that way, and the king is dead, and so's part, so. We're okay to carry on.
Well, he lied,
even though he just lied blatantly, and Everard Digby sort of believed him. So Everard Digby went off somewhere else. These other guys held up at Holbeach House. They're surrounded by a posse. The word posse, people. A bit of a fight, a bit of a problem because their powder was wet and the powder was dry. They left it to wet rather. They left the powder to dry in front of the fire, and a spark came out, hit the powder, whoosh. Bit of a fire, burnt a lot of them quite badly. So the
lesson is don't leave wet gunpowder by a fire.
And there's a bit of a fight. Catesby and a few others were killed, including Thomas Percy. Yeah. And the rest were captured, even though they were wounded. Francis Tresham was captured as well. Yeah. And they were captured and taken down to the Tower. And Everard Digby was also, he actually was surrendered to the authorities. He's fancied himself as a bit of a gentleman, and he surrendered to the authorities. And their whole lot were taken down to the Tower, apart from the servant, who was taken to a different prison, because obviously he wasn't one of the gentry. The servant was a guy called Thomas Bates, and he was a servant to Catesby.
And what happened to these guys after they were taken to the Tower?
There was a bit of rough treatment, and they were prepared for trial, basically. The trials went ahead. Everard Digby was the first to go on trial, and he pleaded guilty, the only one to actually plead guilty. He pleaded guilty, therefore he was allowed a speech at his trial, and he said his piece. If he thought it might have been mitigating for him, no, it wasn't. He was still sentenced to a traitor's death. The others likewise went through a trial. they were going to be found guilty.
Yeah.
Sir Edward Coke, who was the prosecutor, he was going to find them guilty, and they were guilty. They were all found guilty and sentenced to a traitor's death.
Were they all tried at the same time?
No, different batches. Digby was the first to be tried. The others were tried a bit later.
What about Guy Fawkes?
Guy Fawkes was tried with the second batch. The first to go for execution was Everard Digby, and the others followed on a day or so later.
And what type? What you mentioned a traitor's death?
A traitor's death, we commonly call it hung, drawn, and quartered. Now that's incorrect. You're actually drawn, hung, quartered.
Drawn is
now drawn. What normally would happen is you'd be drawn.
You wouldn't have an artist sketching you then?
No, you would. Well, you probably might have done.
You might have.
You were drawn with your feet tied to the back of a horse, and you were literally dragged through the streets. Now, for the purposes of these people, they weren't drawn that way, because by the time they would have got to the executioner, they would have been in no fit condition to endure the punishment, and also it would deny the crowd a nice show because they'd been such a mess. So what they did was they constructed wattle hurdles or sleighs, and they were laid and strapped to these wattle sleds, with the back to the ground, and their face facing the sky, and their head being so low they would not draw the air of ordinary people, and therefore they were dragged in that state to the place of execution, was St Paul's churchyard, which some people thought was a bit not right to do it there, but they did it. St Paul's churchyard by the old cathedral. And in the case of Everard Digby, he was taken to onto the scaffold, and he made a nice speech, but he didn't repent about his sins. And the executioner hung him, but hung him very, very, very short time, because he's not really repented. So he's fully conscious before the executioner set to work. Do you want to know the details of what they did?
Well, I'm sure listeners would like to, but I just wonder whether we ought to put a little health warning on it, Bill.
Yeah, but if I were you, yes.
Okay. So if you want to turn off now, do so.
Essentially, the individual would be hung. In the case of Sir Everard Digby, it was very short. In other ones, they repented fully and they had a longer hanging. They would be they were taken off alive from the noose, dropped down, then put onto a board. The men would then be castrated, and then they would be disemboweled alive. And the heart would be removed. And in the case of Everard Digby, the rumour goes his heart was removed, and as the executioner held it up to the crowd, saying, "This is the heart of a traitor," Sir Everard Digby said, "No, it is not." Now, I somehow suspect that's not quite true.
Probably a bit of an exaggeration.
And then afterwards, the body is quartered. Basically, the limbs are chopped off and paraded. The hair is taken off as well, and that's often put down at Tower Bridge or somewhere like that. And that happened to the others. Now, Guy Fawkes was quite clever about it.
Was he?
Yeah, he was in a dreadful state when he was taken to be executed. He was executed about a day later, and they mounted up a ladder to go up to get the noose. And though he's in a bad condition, his legs could barely work, he actually went up really high up the ladder, and when they put a noose on him, he could jump off, and that would break his neck. So he's actually dead. Oh,
so he killed himself?
Yeah. He cleverly went high up the ladder and jumped down.
And avoided all that
unfortunate thing. And it's really ghastly, because the family would be watching this.
Yeah.
Everard's wife was watching, it was a shame. Robert Catesby didn't have to suffer that. He was killed at Holbeach House.
Yeah.
So he didn't have to suffer. Another one, the conspirators, Francis Tresham, he died of natural causes in the Tower of London.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a death, and then and that was that. And not long afterwards, Parliament instituted a day of celebration for the 5th of November.
And that's where we've carried on.
We carry on.
In quotes, celebrating
Absolutely. And a little quirk of history is, at the time of the Commonwealth, i.e. the time of the end of Charles I and the advent of Cromwell's rule, which we call the Commonwealth, public celebrations were banned throughout England. But the only public celebration that was permitted was the 5th of November, which, oddly enough, was celebrating the preservation of a king. And yet Cromwell and his people had actually executed a king. And it's carried on to this day.
Yeah.
I mean, nowadays it's like a bonfire now, but you don't really see many guys being burned now. But certainly when I were children, it's very, very common.
So
wasn't it?
is the way we celebrate it now, is it just a British thing, or is it celebrated in other countries?
It's basically British.
Yeah.
It did go to the American colonies.
Yeah.
So during the time of the Pilgrim Fathers and people like that, they did celebrate it as being Guy Fawkes night. And that carried on for a while. Then it gradually drifted away from being a celebration of the Gunpowder Plot to an anti-popery celebration. So you'd be, the effigies of the Pope. And it carried on into the 18th century, very, very much that. And then the effigies changed. So you get the effigy of King George III would be burnt instead when you get towards the Revolution, or Lord Bute or Lord.
Yeah, but now we've gone back to the original.
Yeah. And that it's really got, essentially now it's a British thing.
Yeah.
Now whether I don't know whether they do it in Canada or Australia, I probably doubt it, but I don't know. It's essentially British.
So looking back, let's say the plot had been successful and the establishment had been blown up, royalty, and what do you think their legacy would have been? What do you think would have happened?
I just utterly fail to see how they could ever succeed. The level of disgust to the nation would have been massive, but also among Roman Catholics, who the vast bulk were loyal to the crown and their country, and I think the revulsion would have been quite intense. And let's face it, I don't think they gave much thought to what would happen if they were successful. Yeah, about 50 blokes or whatever assembling in the Midlands outside Birmingham. Now, what are they going to do? Come on now. Have they got any generals there? Have they got an aristocrat? They thought they'd recruit the Earl of Northumberland to be their leader. He didn't know anything about it, the Earl of Northumberland, but they thought, oh, well, we'll have a word with him. That sort of thing. So they blow up Parliament. They'll go along to see an English magnate like the Earl of Northumberland and say, oh, can you lead us now? Very naive. I mean, you think of, they've got no generals, no aristocrats, no people with retainers or anything like that. It beggars belief.
So your view is that it would have just fizzled out. They'd have been captured and killed anyway.
I think people would have turned against them. Because certainly when it had failed and they were trying to raise people, nobody would come to their cause.
Yeah.
So I just think it would have just people, sheer revulsion. People would have reacted, Catholic and Protestant, because the damage that they did to English Roman Catholics was immense, absolutely immense. King James, I've no doubt, would have calmed down. He'd got his treaty with Spain. He would have calmed down over the persecution. Yes, there was a big problem with the rising Puritanism in England. They were a big problem. They were very anti-Catholic and stirring things up. But when you had, a plot which was about to blow up the establishment, the laws were enforced, and it kept things in place through up until 1829 when the Catholic Emancipation.
So what was the general feeling in the country after the plot had been discovered? They'd been executed by the general population. What was the general feeling?
Oh, revulsion, and it was not popular.
So they were considered terrorists.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you? If somebody did that to Parliament now,
of course,
what would you call them?
Of course.
Yeah.
And yet, without knowing a lot about it, for some people wouldn't know all that detail. We seem to see Guy Fawkes as almost like a sort of Robin Hood type character. A
bit like the V from Vendetta film, isn't it? The Guy Fawkes masks and things like that. And there is that sort of nobility about it. The underdog going for the establishment. The only man to enter Parliament with the right intention, shall we say. But it is what it is. With 300, 400 years passing, then we can afford that luxury.
Well, Bill, thanks ever so much. That's a really good insight to the history of the Gunpowder Plot, which I think a lot of people probably don't know about.
No, it's interesting times. But to me, the big baddie is Robert Catesby. He's my baddie. Guy Fawkes,
he's your baddie, is he?
I don't mind Guy Fawkes.
No. He was just a mercenary.
He was just a tool in the hands of the Bin Laden of the 17th century.
Yeah. So thanks again for sharing that with us. So just before we go, Bill, what current up-and-coming projects do you have that you'd like to tell listeners about?
Well, we were going to do a lot more in terms of themed walks for the Stamford Guides tours. But unfortunately, from the announcements that occurred recently and all the lockdowns, we've had to put all of that on hold, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But we will be pushing forward with that. I'm currently writing more tours with regard to Stamford. I'm doing a lot of research into the regency time of the Prince Regent George IV and I'm trying to do a bit of writing around that particular topic, which hopefully in maybe about a year's time might come to fruition.
Yeah,
it's a project I've been nursing for quite some time. Having worked in a stately home, you get a bit of a feel for these families and how they got on.
So when you say a project and writing, are you talking about writing a book?
Yes.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and I've visited lots of stately homes, read into the backgrounds of many British aristocratic families, and there's a wealth of things to say about them. I'm not interested in the peasantry, stuff like that. I'm not, I'm interested in the weird antics they got up to and their way of life, which I find absolutely fascinating.
That's brilliant.
That sounds very sort of wrong to say I'm not interested in peasants.
So where can
they'll come in and sort of a side role.
Where can people find out more about your stuff?
Oh, no, a while yet.
You're on Instagram and any social media? Yes,
Instagram, William David Cunningham, I'm on that.
Yeah.
And my Facebook's more a personal thing, to be honest with you.
Yeah, no, we'll put that on. So again, thanks ever so much for coming on the show,
It's
Bill.
always a pleasure, Bob.
Thank you
very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
My thanks go to today's guest, Bill Cunningham, historian and tour guide from the Stamford Mayor's Guides. You have been listening to Undercurrent Stories. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to share the show link to your friends and family, and if you have 60 seconds, I will be most grateful if you would please rate and review. To hear more episodes, please subscribe to the show and visit undercurrentstories.com. If you leave your email in the link, we will notify you as soon as new episodes are released. Also, check out our social media links, details of which can be found on the show notes. Until next time, this is Bob Wells wishing you all the very best.